Despite, or maybe because of, or possibly notwithstanding, or potentially irrespective of, the autocratic nature of the Nog regime, by the time the British Empire was at its height, the Noggin era had come to be regarded as a quasi-mythical time of peace and prosperity. This was because it was in the ruling elite's interests to maintain the illusion that the class structure was innate, inevitable, and groovy. To an uneasy nation troubled by the transformative changes of the Industrial Revolution, the Noggin myth became a vital piece of propaganda. So when, at the turn of the 20th century, a model of an old-fashioned watermill turned up in a shop in Canterbury that was somehow owned by a bad-tempered girl called Emily, instead of using it to illustrate the harsh truth about living conditions in Britain's past, a mouse called Charlie, who was employed by Emily as a part-time organ decoration, took it upon himself to radically reinterpret its function, claiming it was designed to produce chocolate biscuits.
Chocolate biscuits.
Chocolate biscuits.
This was a lie, but a seductive one, and time and again Charlie and his mouse friends would sideline the truth in favour of simplistic fables like this one, enshrining an English nationalistic narrative increasingly at odds with what was really going on. Have we got any chocolate biscuits? The fact was that the milling industry in Britain hadn't really changed in centuries. It had always been a tough and back-breaking profession rather than the pastoral idyll it was usually portrayed as. So much so that in a small rural community such as Camberwick Green, even as late as the mid-1960s, the windmill which provided all the flour for the whole of Trumptonshire was run and maintained by one man, Winford Miller. He was sharper than a thorn, and like a mouse was spry and nimble when he ground the corn, but he received no help and no financial support from the state, relying on charity from his neighbours and forced to bolster his meagre income with sidelines such as selling free-range eggs, then later expensive range eggs. But it was all to no avail, and like many others in his situation, he eventually succumbed to depression and alcoholism. But whilst milling technology stagnated, elsewhere automation had become the norm, such as in the Chigley biscuit factory. We've not got any biscuits at all. Motherfucker. The Chigley biscuit factory, which, ironically, was one of the businesses that placed such unreasonable demands on Miller's productivity. The machines still needed workers to operate them, and the factory owners, in this instance Lord Belborough, continued to reap the benefits and enjoy a luxurious lifestyle, every so often funding cheap entertainments for their employees, such as a village dance, to maintain the semblance of care. So successful was this illusion of beneficence that the workers even clubbed together to buy their employer a present, a working steam engine, reflecting Lord Belborough's private acquisition of much of the rail infrastructure of the country, including the Merioneth and Clanticilly Rail Traction Company. The circle was complete. But a gap was opening up in the middle. For the white-collar workers of the middle classes, many of the old certainties had begun to fall away as the inexorable march of technology spelt the end of their usefulness. At around the same time as Winford Miller was ending each day passed out in a pool of his own urine, and Mr. William Benn, of 52 Festive Road, London, who had been a successful chartered accountant in the post-war boom, found himself with plenty of money, but, in an increasingly computerized world, nothing to do. Out of this exclusively bourgeois form of malaise came a completely new form of industry. Shops like this one sprang up all over London in the 1960s. From their outward appearance they resembled fancy dress shops, but once inside, as if by magic a shopkeeper would appear and encourage his customers to shed their inhibitions and indulge in often chemical-fueled role-play, usually based on the same sort of ersatz English mythos peddled 70 years earlier by Charlie Mouse and his ilk. Mr. Benn's fantasies were typically about kings and queens, knights and princesses, or about colonialism, be it the exploitation of the first American nation, or reckless big-game hunting in Africa. All of these were heavily sanitized and rigorously curated depictions of the past. Even Benn's representation of piracy in the 18th century was a predominantly cosy affair, rather than reflecting the brutal and bloody ordeal it had actually been. But on one day, in 1971, instead of daydreaming about the past, Ben imagined himself an astronaut in an era of interplanetary travel, with incredible technology far in advance of what was possible at the time. But although this fantasy seemed to be looking forwards into the future, culturally it looked backwards. Ben's imaginary adventure involved plundering the mineral wealth of one planet, rejecting the differently shaded inhabitants of another, and the failure to understand and subsequent dismissal of the artistic culture of a third. Ben's dark vision reflected the fact that Britain had never fully come to terms with its loss of empire, and as its borders retracted, even while the official narrative stubbornly maintained the fiction of the UK's cultural dominance, the British populace's innate mistrust of anything other was intensified and codified, mutating into something unknowable and frightening. This, in turn, was to have far-reaching and tragic consequences when mankind actually did make contact with alien life forms. And now I'm going to have some crisps.